I'm Nora, 34, and 3 hours ago my husband destroyed me in front of a packed courtroom. He laughed, actually laughed, while telling the judge I was a liar making up stories to steal his money. The lawyer beside him smirked like they'd just won the lottery. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely blindsided by someone you trusted. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me take you back to this morning. I sat in that sterile courtroom wearing my navy suit, the one David always said made me look professional enough. The wooden benches were filled with strangers who'd wandered in to watch the drama unfold. Just another Tuesday entertainment for them. David walked in wearing his $1,000 suit, the one I'd helped him pick out for important client meetings. His lawyer, Marcus Webb, carried a thick briefcase like he was about to perform surgery. They took their seats across from me with the confidence of men who'd never lost anything important. When the bailiff called our case, my stomach dropped to my shoes. Harper versus Harper, dissolution of marriage proceedings. Judge Morrison reviewed the initial paperwork while David adjusted his tie. The same tie I'd given him for our anniversary 2 years ago. Funny how memories can turn into weapons. Mr. Harper, the judge began, you're requesting full ownership of the marital home and primary business assets? David stood with practiced authority. Yes, Your Honor. My wife has made accusations about hidden assets that are completely fabricated. She's attempting to manipulate these proceedings for financial gain. The words hit me like ice water. Fabricated? I'd spent months carefully documenting his suspicious transactions, the offshore accounts, the shell companies. Everything was real. Marcus Webb rose smoothly. Your Honor, Mrs. Harper has no background in finance or business. These wild accusations appear to be the desperate actions of someone facing the reality of divorce proceedings. I watched the judge's expression shift. Professional sympathy for David, subtle dismissal of me. The script was already written. Mrs. Harper, Judge Morrison addressed me, do you have concrete evidence to support these claims of hidden assets? My lawyer, Patricia Chen, stood beside me. We'd prepared for this moment, though Patricia had insisted we start with standard discovery before revealing the full extent of what I'd uncovered. Sometimes, she'd explained, it's better to let them hang themselves first. Sitting there under David's cold stare, watching him perform his rehearsed innocence, I realized she'd been right. Your Honor, we have banking records showing irregular transfers and— Circumstantial, Marcus interrupted. My client is a successful businessman. Large transactions are normal in his industry. David nodded along, playing the part of the wronged husband perfectly. Your Honor, my wife never showed interest in my business until she realized our marriage was ending. Now suddenly she's a financial detective? A few people in the gallery chuckled. The sound made my cheeks burn. Judge Morrison's patience was wearing thin. Mrs. Harper, without concrete evidence of fraud or hidden assets, I'm inclined to honor the prenuptial agreement and award the primary assets to Mr. Harper. That's when David delivered the final blow. He turned slightly toward me, ensuring the judge could see his face, and said with mock sadness, I tried to protect her from the complexities of business. Maybe I should have involved her more, but she never seemed interested in anything beyond shopping and lunch dates. The casual cruelty of his words, delivered with such calculated precision, took my breath away. Shopping and lunch dates, as if 12 years of supporting his career, managing his household, entertaining his clients, meant nothing. Marcus Webb moved for summary judgment. Given the lack of substantial evidence, we request the court honor the existing prenuptial agreement. Judge Morrison's gavel hovered in the air. In that moment, I saw my future, leaving this courtroom with nothing but my car and whatever clothes I could pack. David would keep the house, the investment accounts, everything we'd built together. The gavel came down with finality. Case dismissed in favor of the plaintiff. Mrs. Harper, you have 30 days to vacate the marital residence. The words echoed in the courtroom like a death sentence. I sat frozen while David and Marcus exchanged satisfied handshakes. People in the gallery began filing out, already moving on with their lives while mine lay shattered. Patricia gathered her papers with practiced efficiency. We can appeal, she whispered, but her tone suggested she wasn't surprised by this outcome. This went exactly as we expected. Now we have them on record with their lies. I nodded, remembering our pre-hearing strategy session. Patricia had been clear. Let them commit to their story first. When we reveal what you really have, it'll be devastating because they'll have already lied under oath. I nodded mutely, watching David button his suit jacket. He looked exactly like the man I'd married 15 years ago. Confident, successful, untouchable. How had I never seen the coldness behind his charming facade? As I stood to leave, my legs felt unsteady. The weight of everyone's stares pressed down on my shoulders. These strangers had witnessed my public humiliation, and tomorrow they'd probably forget my name entirely. The courtroom doors felt impossibly heavy as I pushed through them. The hallway buzzed with lawyers and clients conducting business, their voices blending into white noise. Normal people having normal legal proceedings while my entire world collapsed. That's when I heard Marcus Webb's voice behind me. She walked away with nothing, exactly as we planned. I stopped walking. The words hung in the air like smoke, confirming what I'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. This wasn't just about divorce. It was about deliberate destruction. Couldn't have gone better, David replied, his voice carrying that satisfied tone I'd heard after successful business deals. She never suspected a thing. My hands began trembling, not from sadness anymore, but from rage so pure it felt like electricity in my veins. They were standing maybe 20 feet behind me, probably assuming I'd already left in defeat. I turned around slowly, drinking in their expressions of smug victory. Marcus had loosened his tie. David was checking his phone. Two men celebrating the systematic dismantling of someone else's life. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the hallway. They looked up, startled. David's face shifted from satisfaction to annoyance, like I was interrupting something important. "Did you have something to add, Nora?" His tone dripped with condescension. I walked toward them with measured steps, my heels clicking against the marble floor. Other people in the hallway began to notice the tension, slowing their conversations to watch. "Just wanted to congratulate you both," I said, stopping directly in front of them. That was quite a performance in there. Marcus adjusted his cufflinks, uncomfortable with my proximity. "Mrs. Harper, I understand you're disappointed, but the judge made his decision based on the evidence presented." "Oh, I'm not disappointed," I replied, allowing a small smile to play across my lips. "I'm impressed. The coordination between you two was flawless, especially the part about me being a desperate housewife with no understanding of business." David's jaw tightened. "Nora, don't embarrass yourself further." "Embarrass myself?" I laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut glass. "David, I've been married to you for 12 years. Did you really think I spent all that time shopping and having lunch dates?" Something flickered in his eyes, the first hint of uncertainty I'd seen all day. "What exactly are you implying?" Marcus stepped forward, his lawyer instincts sensing danger. I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope, both men's eyes fixed on it like it might contain a bomb. "I'm not implying anything," I said, tucking the envelope back into my bag. "I'm simply saying that underestimating someone for over a decade gives them plenty of time to pay attention." The color began draining from David's face. "Pay attention to what?" I leaned closer, dropping my voice so only they could hear. "To everything, David. Absolutely everything." The look of growing panic in his eyes told me Patricia's strategy was working perfectly. Let them think they'd won first, then show them how wrong they were. Marcus grabbed David's arm. "We need to go." But I wasn't finished. "Oh, and Marcus, you might want to brush up on federal fraud statutes. Something tells me you're going to need that knowledge very soon." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving them standing in the hallway with expressions of growing panic. The elevator doors closed behind me, finally giving me privacy to process what just happened. My reflection stared back from the polished metal, composed on the surface, volcanic underneath. 12 years of marriage had taught me to read David's expressions like a weather map. The confidence he'd displayed in the courtroom was already cracking, replaced by the twitchy anxiety he got when business deals went sideways. Good. Let him sweat. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "That was interesting. Call me when you're ready to discuss next steps." Next steps. 3 hours ago, I thought those would involve packing my belongings and finding an apartment. Now I had work to do. The parking garage echoed with my footsteps as I walked toward my car. The BMW David had insisted on buying me last year. "Successful men have successful wives," he'd said. Everything in our lives had been about maintaining appearances. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, letting the reality sink in. For 12 years, I'd played the perfect wife, supported his career, managed his social calendar, smiled at his colleagues' wives while they talked about charity galas and vacation homes. What none of them knew was that I had a degree in accounting from Northwestern. I'd given up my career when David's business started taking off, but I'd never stopped understanding numbers. Every financial document that crossed our kitchen table, every business conversation he'd had on speakerphone, every confidential meeting in his home office, I'd absorbed it all. Have you ever been so angry that you suddenly see things with perfect clarity? Comment below if you've ever had that moment where everything clicked into place. The envelope in my purse contained copies of everything I'd collected over the past 18 months. Bank statements showing transfers to accounts I wasn't supposed to know about. Contracts with shell companies that existed only on paper. Email printouts discussing creative accounting methods with his business partner Richard Steele. David thought he was clever, moving money around like a magician's trick. What he didn't realize was that his wife had been watching from the audience, taking notes on every sleight of hand. My phone rang. David's ringtone. I almost declined the call, then decided to answer. This should be entertaining. Nora, what the hell was that stunt you pulled in the hallway? His voice had lost the smooth confidence from the courtroom. Now he sounded like the man who'd panicked when the IRS audited his first business. Hello to you too. David, how's your celebration lunch going? Cut the act. What did you mean about paying attention? What envelope were you waving around? I could picture him pacing, probably in Marcus's office, running his hands through his hair like he did when stressed. Oh, that little thing? Just some light reading material I've been collecting? Collecting what? Exactly? The desperation creeping into his voice was delicious. You know, David, for someone who just convinced a judge that I'm too stupid to understand business, you're certainly worried about what your ignorant ex-wife might know. Silence on the other end. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head, trying to calculate what damage I might be capable of inflicting. Nora, if you're thinking about causing trouble. Trouble? I laughed. David, you haven't seen trouble yet. But you will. I hung up and immediately called Patricia. I need to schedule a meeting, I said when she answered. And bring your federal fraud contact. We have a case to build. Patricia's office overlooked downtown Seattle, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Elliott Bay. I'd been here countless times during the divorce proceedings, but today felt different. Today, I wasn't the victim seeking help. I was a woman with ammunition. Show me what you have, Patricia said, settling across from me with a legal pad and coffee. I opened the manila envelope and spread its contents across her mahogany desk. Bank statements, emails, contract copies, wire transfer records. 2 years of careful documentation laid out like evidence at a crime scene. Patricia's eyebrows rose as she examined the paperwork. Nora, where did you get these? David's home office has terrible security for someone hiding financial crimes, I replied. Also, he never changed the password on his email account. It's still our wedding anniversary. Romantic, don't you think? She picked up a bank statement showing a $200,000 transfer to something called Cascade Holdings LLC. Her expression grew more serious as she cross-referenced it with David's business tax returns. This company isn't listed anywhere in his asset disclosure, she murmured, making notes. And look at this. 3 transfers in 6 months, all to the same account. I leaned forward. Cascade Holdings is registered to a P.O. box in Delaware. But the interesting part is who's listed as the company's president. Patricia flipped through the incorporation papers I'd somehow acquired. Her pen stopped moving when she reached the signature page. Richard Steele, she said quietly. David's business partner. The same Richard Steele who testified in our divorce proceedings that David's company was struggling financially, I added. Funny how struggling companies can afford to move 6-figure sums to shell companies, isn't it? Patricia was already reaching for her phone. I need to call Tom Brennan at the U.S. Attorney's Office. This looks like systematic fraud. While she made the call, I studied the city view outside her windows. Somewhere out there, David was probably having lunch, celebrating his courtroom victory. He had no idea that his perfect crime was about to unravel. Tom can see us Thursday morning, Patricia said, hanging up. But Nora, I need you to understand something. If we pursue this, there's no going back. Federal fraud investigations don't end quietly. I thought about the look on Marcus Webb's face when I mentioned federal statutes. The way David's voice cracked when he called me afterward. The 12 years I'd spent building a life with a man who'd planned my destruction from the beginning. Good, I said. I don't want quiet anymore. Patricia nodded approvingly. There's something else. If we can prove the assets were hidden through fraudulent means, the divorce settlement becomes void. Everything gets reconsidered. Including the house? Including everything. I felt something unfamiliar spreading through my chest. Not anger this time, but anticipation. David had spent months orchestrating my humiliation, believing I was too naive to fight back effectively. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. One more thing, I said, pulling out my phone. I have recordings. Patricia's eyes widened. Recordings of what? I scrolled through the voice memo app, finding the files I'd saved over the past 2 years. David liked to conduct business calls from home. He thought I wasn't listening, but I was always listening. I pressed play on one file. David's voice filled the office, discussing creative fund management with Richard Steele. Then another recording detailing plans to keep Nora in the dark until after the divorce. Patricia sat back in her chair, staring at me with new respect. How long have you been planning this? Since I found the first suspicious bank statement he tried to hide, I replied. That was 2 years ago. It made me start paying closer attention to everything. David always said I wasn't cut out for business. Turns out I'm a natural investigator. My phone buzzed with another call from David. This time I declined it immediately. Let him wonder. Let him worry. Let him finally understand what it felt like to be powerless. When do we start? I asked. Patricia smiled grimly. We already have. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Seattle weather that matched my mood perfectly. I dressed carefully, the same navy suit from the divorce hearing, but this time with different accessories. Today called for my grandmother's pearl earrings, the ones that made me feel connected to a woman who'd survived much worse than a cheating husband. The federal building downtown looked imposing under the cloudy sky, all concrete and glass designed to intimidate. But as I walked through the metal detectors, I felt calmer than I had in months. Today, I wasn't the victim in someone else's story. Tom Brennan's office was exactly what I'd expected from a federal prosecutor. American flags, law books, and the kind of serious furniture that suggested he'd seen every type of financial crime imaginable. Mrs. Harper, he said, shaking my hand with professional warmth, Patricia's told me quite a bit about your situation. Patricia had prepared him well. The evidence was already laid out on his conference table, organized into neat piles that told the story of David's deception. Walk me through this, Brennan said, gesturing to the documents. Start from the beginning. I took a breath, gathering my thoughts. My husband spent our entire marriage convincing everyone, including me sometimes, that I was financially naive. But he made one critical mistake, which was, he did all his scheming from our home office, and he never bothered to soundproof it. I played the first recording, watching Brennan's expression shift from polite interest to sharp attention. David's voice filled the room, casually discussing how to restructure assets to minimize exposure in case of divorce proceedings. When was this recorded? Brennan asked. 2 years ago, I replied. About a year before he filed for divorce. Patricia leaned forward. The timeline shows clear premeditation. He was planning the financial deception long before any marriage problems surfaced. Brennan examined the bank records, cross-referencing them with corporate filings. These transfers to Cascade Holdings, they're structured to avoid reporting requirements. Classic structuring behavior. That's not even the best part, I said, producing another folder. David's company received federal contracts for environmental consulting work. Some of these diverted funds came from taxpayer money. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Brennan's pen stopped moving. You're telling me he defrauded the federal government? I'm telling you he got greedy, I replied. David always said that was other people's weakness, but it turned out to be his own. Brennan spent the next hour reviewing every document, making notes and asking detailed questions. I'd been married to a manipulator long enough to read people's expressions, and his told me everything I needed to know. We had him. Mrs. Harper, Brennan said finally, I'm going to be direct with you. Based on what you've shown me, your husband is likely facing federal charges for money laundering, fraud, and misappropriation of government funds. The words should have made me feel vindicated, but instead, I felt hollow. 12 years of marriage, reduced to criminal charges and federal case numbers. What happens next? I asked. We investigate. Quietly at first, then not so quietly. If the evidence holds up, and it looks like it will, we'll move for indictments. Patricia gathered the papers. What about the divorce settlement? That becomes the least of his problems, Brennan replied. Assets obtained through criminal activity are subject to seizure. The house, the business, all of it becomes evidence in a federal case. As we left the federal building, I felt my phone vibrating. David had been calling constantly since Tuesday, his messages growing more desperate with each attempt. Maybe you should talk to him, Patricia suggested. Let him know what's coming. I considered it, then shook my head. He'll find out soon enough. But curiosity got the better of me. That evening, I finally listened to his voicemails. Nora, we need to talk. I think there's been some misunderstanding about the divorce settlement. Then, hours later, look, maybe we can work something out. You know I've always taken care of you. And finally, this morning. Nora, I know you're angry, but whatever you're planning, it's a mistake. Call me back. I deleted them all and poured myself a glass of wine. Tomorrow, federal agents would begin reviewing David's business records. Next week, they'd probably execute search warrants. David Harper, successful businessman and master manipulator, was about to learn that the wife he'd dismissed as financially incompetent had built the case that would destroy him. Monday morning brought the first visible crack in David's facade. I was having coffee at our usual corner bakery. Well, what used to be our usual place when we still did things together, when I spotted him through the window. He looked terrible. Hair disheveled, shirt wrinkled, the kind of appearance that would have horrified the David I'd known. He was pacing back and forth on his phone, gesturing frantically at someone who clearly wasn't giving him the answers he wanted. I sipped my latte and watched the show. After 12 years of marriage, this was the first time I'd seen David genuinely panic, and I had to admit, it was oddly satisfying. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Federal agents executed search warrants this morning. It's officially started. Through the window, I watched David's conversation grow more animated. His face was red, and he kept running his hands through his hair. Whatever news he was receiving, it wasn't good. The bakery door chimed, and David walked in, still clutching his phone. Our eyes met across the small space, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then he walked over to my table like a man approaching his execution. "Nora," he said, his voice hoarse. "We need to talk." I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "By all means." He sat down heavily, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "Federal agents were at my office this morning. They seized my computer, my files, everything." "That sounds stressful," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "They're saying I committed fraud, money laundering. They think I stole government money." I tilted my head, studying his face. "Did you?" The question hung between us like a loaded gun. David's mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice. "It's not that simple. Business is complicated. Sometimes money moves in ways that look criminal," I suggested helpfully. His composure finally cracked completely. "Nora, they could take everything. The house, the business, my reputation. I could go to prison." I set down my coffee cup carefully. "And you're telling me this because I know you're involved somehow. This isn't coincidence. First you make threats in the courthouse hallway. Now federal agents are crawling through my business records. Smart man, my husband. Too bad he'd underestimated me for over a decade." "David," I said slowly, "do you remember what you said in that courtroom? About me being financially naive? About how I spent my time shopping and having lunch dates?" He shifted uncomfortably. "That was just for the judge. You know I didn't mean—" "Actually, I think you meant every word." I leaned forward. "You've spent our entire marriage believing I was too stupid to understand what you were doing. Even now, sitting here while your world collapses, you can't quite believe that your ignorant little wife might be capable of bringing you down." The color drained from his face. "What did you do?" "I paid attention, David. Something you never expected me to do." He stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Maybe he was. "The recordings, the bank statements, the emails. It was all you?" I smiled. "Every single piece of evidence. Collected over 18 months of careful observation." David's hands began trembling. "Nora, if you help them convict me, you'll get nothing. They'll seize every asset we have. We don't have any assets, David. You made sure of that in court last week. Remember? I walked away with nothing." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. In his effort to keep everything from me, he'd put everything at risk. "I can fix this," he said desperately. "I can make the charges go away, restructure the business, give you whatever you want in the divorce." I stood up, gathering my purse. "It's too late for that." "Nora, please, I'm begging you." I looked down at him. This powerful man reduced to pleading in a coffee shop. A year ago, the sight would have broken my heart. Today, it felt like justice. "You know what the funny thing is, David? If you'd just been honest about the divorce, split things fairly, none of this would have happened. But you got greedy. You wanted to humiliate me and keep everything for yourself." I started toward the door, then turned back. "Oh, and David? You might want to call a criminal defense attorney. Something tells me Marcus Webb specializes in the wrong kind of law for what's coming next." As I walked out, I heard him frantically dialing his phone. But it was too late for lawyers, too late for damage control, too late for anything except consequences. The investigation was just beginning, but David Harper's reign as an untouchable businessman was already over. What do you think will happen when the full scope of David's crimes comes to light? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for the next part of this story. Phase 1 was complete. Phase 2 was about to begin. 2 weeks after my coffee shop encounter with David, Patricia called with news that made me smile for the first time in months. "The federal investigation gave us everything we needed," she said. "I'm filing a motion to reopen the discovery phase of your divorce proceedings." I was sitting in my temporary apartment, a furnished studio that cost more per month than most people's mortgages, staring at the single window that faced a brick wall. David's handiwork had left me here, but not for much longer. "What are our chances?" I asked. "With federal agents confirming financial fraud, I'd say we're about to even the playing field." Within 48 hours, Judge Morrison's clerk called to schedule a new hearing. The same courtroom where I'd been humiliated 3 weeks earlier would now witness the second act of this drama. David's panic was becoming increasingly public. Richard Steele had already retained separate counsel and was reportedly cooperating fully with federal investigators, corporate speak for throwing David under the bus to save his own skin. Marcus Webb, meanwhile, had gone from confident divorce attorney to deer in headlights. Word travels fast in legal circles, and everyone knew he was in over his head with a federal fraud case attached to what should have been a simple dissolution proceeding. I spent the weekend preparing, not just legally, but mentally. The first hearing had caught me off guard, David's performance calibrated to maximum humiliation. This time would be different. Sunday evening, David called one final time. Nora, I know things got complicated, but we can still work this out privately. Complicated? I almost laughed. David, you committed federal crimes to steal from me in our divorce. I wouldn't call that complicated. I'd call it stupid. Those charges won't stick. You'll see. This whole investigation will fall apart, and then where will you be? Sitting in our house that you won't own anymore, I replied. Enjoying the view from windows you'll never see again. His breathing became labored. You have no idea what you've unleashed. When this backfires, it won't. I hung up and turned off my phone. Whatever happened next week, I was ready. Monday morning, I dressed with the same care I'd shown for the first hearing, but this time I chose different armor. Red blazer, black skirt, my grandmother's watch. The combination that made me feel powerful instead of defensive. The courtroom looked identical, but everything else had changed. Gone were the casual observers looking for entertainment. Today's audience consisted of federal prosecutors, financial investigators, and journalists who'd caught wind of a story involving government contracts and hidden assets. David walked in looking like he'd aged 5 years in 3 weeks. His expensive suit couldn't hide the stress lines around his eyes or the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. Marcus Webb carried himself with the desperate confidence of a man hoping his reputation might survive what was coming. As I took my seat, I caught sight of Tom Brennan in the gallery, nodding slightly in my direction. The federal investigation was proceeding parallel to these divorce proceedings, and today those two tracks would finally converge. Judge Morrison entered with an expression I'd never seen before. The careful neutrality of someone who'd realized his previous ruling might have been based on fraudulent information. We're here to review new evidence in the matter of Harper versus Harper, he announced. Mrs. Harper's counsel has requested to reopen discovery based on information obtained through federal investigation. Patricia stood with the controlled grace of a prosecutor presenting a murder case. Your Honor, we have substantial evidence that Mr. Harper systematically concealed assets and committed fraud during our initial proceedings. She gestured towards several boxes of documents that hadn't been present 3 weeks ago. We're prepared to present financial records, recorded conversations, and federal investigative findings that demonstrate deliberate deception. Marcus Webb rose shakily. Your Honor, these allegations are documented, Patricia interrupted smoothly, by Mr. Harper's own actions and words. Judge Morrison's gavel had barely touched the bench when Patricia began laying out the evidence that would destroy David's carefully constructed lies. The moment Patricia pressed play on the first recording, I watched David's face transform from forced confidence to barely controlled terror. His own voice filled the courtroom. The key is keeping Nora completely in the dark about the Cascade Holdings transfers. If she doesn't know the money exists, she can't claim it in the divorce. Judge Morrison's expression hardened as he listened to my husband casually discussing strategies to defraud me. The federal prosecutors in the gallery took notes, their pens moving rapidly across legal pads. This recording was made in the defendant's home office 14 months ago, Patricia explained. Mrs. Harper documented these conversations as part of her growing suspicion that assets were being hidden. Marcus Webb was frantically shuffling through papers, looking for some defense against audio evidence of his client's guilt. David sat rigid, staring at the table as his own words condemned him. The second recording was even more damaging. Richard's got the Delaware company set up perfectly. We can funnel the government contract money through there, clean it up, and by the time the divorce is final, it'll look like legitimate business income. Your Honor, Marcus attempted weakly, these recordings were obtained without my client's knowledge. In his own home, Judge Morrison interrupted, by his own wife. Continue, Ms. Chen. Patricia moved to the financial documents, spreading bank statements across the defense table like a dealer revealing a losing hand. Each paper told part of the story. Transfers to shell companies, inflated invoices, money disappearing into accounts I'd never been told about. Mr. Harper's business received $1.2 million in federal environmental consulting contracts over the past 2 years, Patricia explained. Our analysis shows that approximately 40% of those funds were diverted through fraudulent invoicing and transferred to hidden accounts. David's breathing became audible across the courtroom. The confident businessman who'd humiliated me 3 weeks ago was dissolving before everyone's eyes. Furthermore, Patricia continued, we have evidence that Mr. Harper created Meridian Environmental Services, the shell company receiving these diverted funds, using his wife's social security number and personal information without her knowledge. Judge Morrison's pen stopped moving. He created fraudulent companies in Mrs. Harper's name? Yes, Your Honor. making her unknowingly complicit in federal fraud while simultaneously claiming she was too financially naive to understand his business operations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. David had used my identity to commit crimes while arguing I was too stupid to recognize crimes. Marcus Webb made one last desperate attempt. Your Honor, even if irregularities exist in my client's business practices, that doesn't necessarily impact the divorce settlement. It does when those business practices constitute criminal fraud, Tom Brennan said, rising from the gallery. Your Honor, the U.S. Attorney's Office formally notifies this court that Mr. Harper is under federal investigation for money laundering, fraud, and misappropriation of government funds. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. David's face went completely white. Judge Morrison set down his pen and stared directly at my soon-to-be ex-husband. Mr. Harper, do you understand that assets obtained through criminal activity cannot be protected in divorce proceedings? David's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Marcus Webb whispered urgently in his ear, but David seemed incapable of processing information. Your Honor, Patricia said, producing yet another folder, we have documentation showing that the marital home's mortgage was paid down using funds from these fraudulent transfers. The investment accounts Mr. Harper was awarded in the original settlement were funded through the same criminal enterprise. I sat quietly, watching the systematic demolition of David's lies. 3 weeks ago, he'd portrayed me as a desperate housewife making wild accusations. Today, federal prosecutors were confirming every detail of my fabricated claims. The man who'd laughed at my evidence was discovering that his wife had built an airtight case against him. But we weren't finished yet. Patricia saved the most devastating revelation for last. Your Honor, there's one more thing the court should know about Mrs. Harper's alleged ignorance of her husband's business affairs. She pulled out a document that made David's eyes widen in recognition and terror. Mrs. Harper holds a bachelor's degree in accounting from Northwestern University, summa cum laude. She worked as a forensic accountant for 3 years before their marriage. Mr. Harper's claims about her financial incompetence were, shall we say, greatly exaggerated. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose as he processed this information. David turned to stare at me with something approaching horror. In that moment, he finally understood. The naive wife he'd manipulated for 12 years had never existed. I'd been watching, learning, and documenting his crimes the entire time. The predator had married an accountant and somehow convinced himself she wouldn't notice his fraud. Judge Morrison called for a 30-minute recess, but the real drama was happening in the hallway. David cornered me near the water fountains, his composure completely shattered. Forensic accountant? His voice cracked. 12 years, Nora, 12 years you let me believe that I was stupid? I filled my paper cup with ice-cold water, buying time to savor his realization. David, you convinced yourself I was stupid because it was easier than admitting you married someone smarter than you. His hands were visibly shaking now. Why didn't you stop me? If you knew what I was doing, I turned to face him fully. Stop you from what? Making it easier to divorce you? Providing evidence of your crimes? Why would I interrupt you while you were destroying yourself so efficiently? Marcus Webb approached with the desperate urgency of a man watching his career implode. Mrs. Harper, perhaps we could discuss a settlement. Settlement? I laughed, the sound echoing off the marble walls. Marcus, your client is facing federal charges. What exactly do you think he has left to settle with? David grabbed my arm, then immediately released it when he realized several court officers were watching. Nora, please, I know I made mistakes, but you can't let them destroy me completely. I'm not destroying you, David. You destroyed yourself. I just documented it. The bailiff called us back to the courtroom, where Judge Morrison had clearly spent his recess reviewing federal statutes regarding criminally obtained assets. Before we proceed, he announced, I want to clarify something for the record. Mrs. Harper, is it true that you hold an accounting degree from Northwestern? I stood. Yes, Your Honor. Bachelor of Science in Accounting, 1998. I specialized in forensic analysis of financial crimes. And you worked in this field before your marriage? For 3 years at Morrison & Associates? Investigating corporate fraud cases. Judge Morrison's expression was unreadable, but I could sense his growing anger at having been manipulated during our first hearing. Mr. Harper, were you aware of your wife's educational and professional background when you testified about her alleged financial incompetence? David opened and closed his mouth several times before managing. She hadn't worked in that field for years. That wasn't my question. Were you aware that she possessed the exact skills necessary to recognize financial fraud when she saw it? The silence stretched until it became painful. Marcus Webb nudged his client, but David seemed incapable of forming words. I'll take that as a yes, Judge Morrison said dryly. Patricia stood to deliver the final blow. Your Honor, We'd like to present one additional piece of evidence, the key to this entire case. She produced a manila folder I'd never seen before. When Mr. Harper created Meridian Environmental Services using his wife's personal information, he made a critical error. He registered Mrs. Harper as the company's secretary and listed her as an authorized signatory on all accounts. David's face went completely white. What does that mean? Practically speaking, Judge Morrison asked. It means that Mrs. Harper is legally entitled to access all company records, financial statements, and bank accounts. She has been unknowingly authorized to investigate her own husband's fraud for the past 2 years. The elegant simplicity of it was breathtaking. David had unknowingly given me legal access to document his own crimes. Judge Morrison was struggling to contain what looked like judicial fury. Mr. Harper, let me understand this correctly. You used your wife's identity to create fraudulent companies, then testified under oath that she was too financially naive to understand your business operations? Your Honor, I can explain. Please do. But David couldn't explain because there was no explanation that didn't confirm his guilt. He'd trapped himself in a web of lies so elaborate that every thread led back to criminal fraud. Marcus Webb made one final, desperate attempt. Your Honor, my client requests time to consult with criminal defense counsel. I'm sure he does, Judge Morrison replied coldly. But we're here to address the divorce settlement that was based on fraudulent testimony and hidden assets. The judge opened the thick folder containing federal financial analysis of David's business operations. As he reviewed the documents, his expression grew increasingly grim. Mr. Harper, based on the evidence presented today, it's clear that you systematically defrauded both your wife and the federal government. The assets you were awarded in our previous ruling were obtained through criminal activity. David was gripping the table so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Mrs. Harper, Judge Morrison continued, you were correct. Your husband did hide assets. Approximately $800,000 in criminally obtained funds that should have been disclosed in these proceedings. The number hit David like a physical blow. He'd spent so much energy convincing everyone I was paranoid that he'd forgotten how much he'd actually stolen. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished destroying him yet. The court's previous ruling is hereby vacated, Judge Morrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. All assets awarded to Mr. Harper are immediately frozen pending federal criminal proceedings. The words echoed through the courtroom like a funeral bell. David slumped in his chair as if someone had cut his strings. Furthermore, the judge continued, under federal statutes governing criminally obtained assets, Mr. Harper has no legal claim to any property purchased with fraudulent funds. This includes the marital residence, investment accounts, and business assets. Marcus Webb was frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating how to distance himself from this disaster. His reputation was taking collateral damage from David's spectacular downfall. Your Honor, Marcus attempted weakly, my client requests consideration of— Your client is in no position to request anything, Judge Morrison cut him off. Mr. Harper deliberately perjured himself in my courtroom, concealed criminal activity, and attempted to use divorce proceedings to legitimize stolen assets. I sat perfectly still, watching 12 years of manipulation finally catch up with David. The man who'd convinced me I was lucky to have him was discovering what it felt like to lose everything. Patricia stood to present the final accounting. Your Honor, based on federal financial analysis, we've calculated the total value of assets obtained through criminal activity. She handed documents to the clerk, who passed them to Judge Morrison. As he reviewed the numbers, his expression grew more severe. The marital home was purchased with a down payment of $200,000 from fraudulent funds. Monthly mortgage payments totaling $180,000 over 4 years came from the same illegal source. Investment accounts worth $400,000 were funded entirely through criminal enterprise. David made a sound somewhere between a groan and a whimper. Additionally, Patricia continued, Mr. Harper's business partner, Richard Steele, has provided sworn testimony that Mr. Harper was the primary architect of the fraud scheme. Mr. Steele is cooperating with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Even his best friend had abandoned him. David was learning that loyalty purchased with stolen money doesn't last long when federal prosecutors come calling. Judge Morrison set down the financial documents and fixed David with a stare that could have melted steel. Mr. Harper, in 30 years on this bench, I have rarely encountered such a comprehensive betrayal of judicial process. Your Honor, You will remain silent unless I ask you a direct question. David's mouth snapped shut. You came into my courtroom 3 weeks ago and painted your wife as a delusional woman making desperate accusations. You presented yourself as a successful businessman victimized by a vengeful spouse. Judge Morrison's voice was getting quieter, which somehow made it more frightening. Meanwhile, you were using your wife's own identity to commit federal crimes, stealing government money, and hiding assets through shell companies. Then you had the audacity to claim she was too financially incompetent to understand business operations. The judge paused, letting the weight of David's deception settle over the courtroom. Mr. Harper, your wife understood your business operations better than you realized. She understood them well enough to build an airtight federal case against you. I felt something shift in my chest. Not victory exactly, but vindication. For 12 years, David had made me feel small, incompetent, lucky to be married to someone so successful. Today, everyone could see who was actually the smarter spouse. The court hereby awards Mrs. Harper exclusive possession of the marital residence, pending federal asset forfeiture proceedings. All joint accounts, investment portfolios, and business interests are transferred to Mrs. Harper's control. David's breathing became ragged. Everything he'd tried to steal from me was flowing back, plus interest. Furthermore, Mr. Harper will pay Mrs. Harper's legal fees for both divorce proceedings, as well as costs associated with the federal investigation his crimes necessitated. Judge Morrison's gavel hovered in the air, ready to deliver the final blow to David's carefully constructed life. This court is also referring this matter to the State Bar Association for investigation of Mr. Webb's conduct in presenting potentially fraudulent testimony. Marcus Webb went completely pale. His career was now collateral damage in David's war against me. Mr. Harper, you are ordered to vacate the marital residence within 48 hours. You are prohibited from accessing any joint financial accounts or conducting any business transactions without court approval. The gavel came down with finality, but Judge Morrison wasn't quite finished. One final observation, Mr. Harper. Your wife gave up a promising career in forensic accounting to support your ambitions. She spent 12 years helping you build a business empire, while you convinced her she wasn't smart enough to understand what she was building. David was staring at his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. It turns out she was smart enough to destroy that empire when you tried to steal it from her. I suggest you remember that during your upcoming federal trial. Court was adjourned, but the real consequences were just beginning. The courtroom emptied slowly, like water draining from a bathtub. Federal prosecutors clustered around Tom Brennan, discussing warrant schedules and indictment timelines. Journalists scribbled final notes about the businessman who'd tried to defraud his forensic accountant wife. David remained seated at the defendant's table, staring at nothing. The confident man who'd walked into divorce court 3 weeks ago had been replaced by someone hollow, defeated, and facing federal prison time. Marcus Webb was already packing his briefcase with the frantic efficiency of a man planning to be anywhere else. His partnership track at his prestigious firm had probably evaporated, along with his client's freedom. Marcus, David said quietly, his first word since the judge's ruling. Marcus paused but didn't look up from his packing. David, I can't represent you in criminal proceedings. You'll need a federal defense attorney. That's not what I meant. David's voice was barely audible. How did we miss it? How did we not see what she was doing? Marcus finally looked at his ruined client. We saw exactly what she wanted us to see. A quiet housewife who stayed out of business discussions. But she was documenting everything. For months. Years, I corrected, speaking for the first time since the ruling. Both men turned toward me. I'd been sitting quietly, watching David process the complete destruction of his life. I've been documenting your fraud for over 2 years. I continued, gathering my own papers. Since the first time you mentioned Cascade Holdings during a phone call you thought I wasn't listening to. David's eyes widened. The kitchen conversation with Richard. You heard that? I smiled. David, our house has an open floor plan. I heard everything. Your mistake was thinking I was too stupid to understand what I was hearing. Marcus Webb fled the courtroom like his suit was on fire, probably calculating how to explain this disaster to his senior partners. His career would survive, but his reputation as a sharp divorce attorney was finished. David and I were alone now, except for court officers maintaining professional distance. Nora, he said, his voice breaking slightly, I know I can't fix this, but I need you to understand something. I waited, curious what final manipulation he might attempt. I never meant for it to go this far. The business stuff, it started small. Just creative accounting to maximize profits. And then we were making so much money that stopping seemed stupid. Richard convinced me we could hide enough assets to protect everything if our marriage fell apart. I studied his face, looking for any trace of the man I'd once loved. So you decided to destroy me in court to cover your crimes. That was Marcus's idea. He said if we could paint you as financially incompetent, no one would take your fraud accusations seriously. The casual cruelty of it still stung. 12 years of marriage reduced to a legal strategy designed to humiliate me into silence. You know what the truly stupid part is? I said. If you'd just been honest about the divorce, split everything fairly, I might never have looked closely enough at your business to discover the fraud. David's laugh was bitter. You would have found it eventually. You're too good at this. He was probably right. Numbers don't lie, and I'd always been good at making them tell their stories. What happens now? He asked. I looked around the empty courtroom where my marriage had officially ended. Now, you face federal charges for fraud and money laundering. I rebuild my life with assets that were legitimately mine all along. Will you? He hesitated. Will you visit me? In prison? The question hung between us like smoke. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, to remember the good times before greed consumed his judgment. Instead, I thought about him laughing while Marcus described my desperate accusations. I remembered his voice on those recordings, casually discussing how to keep me completely in the dark. No, David, I won't. I stood and walked toward the exit, my heels clicking against marble with the rhythm of finality. Nora! He called after me. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I paused at the courtroom doors but didn't turn around. For what it's worth, David, you should have thought about that before you tried to destroy me. The hallway outside was buzzing with activity. Patricia was giving interviews to reporters, explaining how a diligent wife's concerns had uncovered $1 million fraud scheme. Tom Brennan approached me with professional sympathy. Mrs. Harper, I know this has been difficult. How are you holding up? I considered the question seriously. 3 weeks ago, I'd left this building with nothing but my car and wounded pride. Today, I was leaving with my house, my finances, and my self-respect restored. I'm doing better than expected, I replied honestly. As I walked toward the courthouse exit, my phone buzzed with text messages. Friends offering congratulations. My sister asking if the news reports were real. My former boss at the accounting firm, wondering if I was interested in consulting work. For the first time in years, people were seeing me as Nora Harper, forensic accountant and federal witness, rather than David Harper's wife. The transformation felt like sunlight after a long winter. 2 years later, I woke up in my own house, truly my own now, with the deed bearing only my name. Sunlight streamed through windows I'd cleaned myself, across floors I'd chosen to refinish in cherry instead of David's preferred oak. The newspaper on my kitchen table featured a small article on page 6. Local businessman sentenced to 8 years for federal fraud. David Harper, once a prominent figure in Seattle's environmental consulting industry, had finally exhausted his appeals and would spend the next decade learning that prison food doesn't care about your previous net worth. Marcus Webb had survived the Barr investigation with a reprimand and a year's suspension. He was reportedly selling insurance now, which seemed appropriate for someone whose legal career had become uninsurable. Richard Steele received 3 years in minimum security prison for cooperation. Apparently, loyalty among thieves really does have its price limits. My phone rang, Patricia calling with final paperwork details. The federal asset forfeiture is complete, she reported. Everything's officially yours now. House, investments, even David's business equipment. What about the environmental consulting contracts? Those died with his federal conviction. But the business assets alone were worth enough to fund a very comfortable early retirement. I looked around my kitchen, remembering all the mornings I'd made coffee while listening to David's confidential phone calls. If he'd known his wife was mentally cataloging his crimes while brewing his favorite Ethiopian blend, things might have turned out differently. Patricia, I've been thinking about something. What's that? I want to start consulting again. Forensic accounting, specifically divorce cases where one spouse suspects financial hiding. Patricia's laugh was warm. Nora, you'd be booked solid within a month. Solid. Half the divorce attorneys in Seattle would refer cases to you. It was true. The case that destroyed David had made me something of a local legend. The housewife who'd outsmarted federal investigators, built an airtight fraud case, and turned her husband's weapons against him. 18 months ago, 18 months. During David's sentencing hearing, I'd sat in the gallery watching him shuffle to the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his choices. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, David had stood and delivered what might have been his first honest statement in years. Your Honor, I spent 12 years married to a brilliant woman and somehow convinced myself she was too stupid to notice my crimes. The fault isn't in her documentation or the federal investigation. The fault is in my own arrogance. He'd paused, looking back toward where I sat. My wife tried to support my legitimate success for over a decade. I threw that away because I thought I was smarter than everyone else, including her. I wasn't. 8 years seemed appropriate for someone who'd stolen government money and tried to frame his wife as delusional. Now, 2 years later, I was rebuilding more than just my finances. I was rebuilding myself. The doorbell rang, interrupting my reflection. My neighbor, Carol, stood on the porch holding a casserole dish. Thought you might want some company for dinner, she said. Unless you have plans? I did have plans. I was meeting with 3 potential clients next week. Women who suspected their husbands were hiding assets and needed someone who understood how to find money that didn't want to be found. But dinner with Carol sounded perfect. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. I was just thinking about how much can change in 2.5 years. We settled in my living room with wine and casserole, talking about everything except federal fraud cases and prison sentences. Normal conversation with someone who knew my story but didn't define me by it. Later that evening, after Carol left, I sat at David's old desk, my desk now, reviewing case files from potential clients. Each story was familiar. Successful husband, financially dependent wife, suspicious transactions that nobody wanted to explain. I'd been that woman once, convinced I was lucky to be married to someone so much more capable than myself. Now I knew better. My reflection in the window showed someone I was still getting to know. Nora Harper, forensic accountant. Nora Harper, federal witness. Nora Harper, the woman who'd turned her husband's fraud scheme into his destruction. The woman who'd learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply being underestimated. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I passed the framed newspaper article Patricia had given me. The headline read, "Wife's investigation uncovers $1 million fraud scheme." Below the headline was a photo of me leaving the courthouse after David's sentencing. I was walking alone, head high, carrying a briefcase full of documents that had rewritten both our lives. The woman in that photo looked nothing like the confused housewife who'd been humiliated in divorce court 2.5 years earlier. She looked like someone who knew exactly what she was worth. And for the first time in 12 years, that assessment was completely accurate. David had spent our marriage convincing me I was dependent on his success. In the end, his success had been dependent on my silence. When I stopped being silent, his empire crumbled completely. Mine was just beginning. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more true stories about people who refuse to stay victims. Sometimes the person who underestimates you gives you exactly the weapon you need to defeat them.